morning, people. I'm sure you've seen the news about how Donald Trump has had his mugshot taken because of the charges against him for trying to overturn the 2020 election. Now, I'm sure we can all agree that that picture of Donald Trump facing potential jail time could very easily put the hub out of business. But I have a question. Why isn't that happening here with Boris Johnson and his mates? Why aren't they going to jail too? Because how many times have we heard the news report that a politician has acted unlawfully, that the government has broken the law, that an MP has broken the ministerial code, or that an MP is getting money from places they're not supposed to, and instead of going to jail, they're allowed to stay as members of parliament and even run for election again? Because sure, Donald Trump spent years radicalizing people with conspiracy theories about how the establishment was trying to rig democracy against the wishes of the people. He unlawfully asked officials to shift the balance of democracy in his favor and deliberately used violent language which endangered the lives of fellow politicians. But Boris Johnson did all those things too, so shouldn't he be in jail or at least prosecuted by now? Okay, let's do the radicalization and conspiracy theories bit. Boris Johnson's whole shtick for the 4 years after the referendum was that whatever deal he negotiated with the EU was automatically the will of the people. Because he voted against Theresa May's Brexit deal, saying that was a betrayal of the people, and that any politician who opposed his versions of Brexit was also betraying the people. Now, not only is that textbook populism where you pretend that whatever you want to do is what the people want to do so that you embody the will of the people like some kind of cult leader, but it's also a lie. Because Boris Johnson literally said in 2016 that we would get a deal with the EU that would make sure that our trade with the EU wasn't damaged at all.
All those who say that there would be barriers to trade with Europe if we were to do a Brexit, it is totally and utterly absurd. And I think it's time to ignore the pessimists and to do a new deal that would be good for Britain and good for Europe too.
So to then pretend that anybody who opposed no-deal Brexit was betraying the will of the people? This is how you radicalize a population. But you don't even have to listen to me. Listen to Claire Fox, an MEP of the literal Brexit party.
I actually think that Leave voters have been radicalised by the last 4 years. Let's be honest, people didn't vote for no deal, but now, if you ask the majority of Leavers if they go for no deal, they'd say, no deal, absolutely.
So, radicalization based on a lie about the establishment thwarting the will of the people? Tick. So what about unlawfully asking officials to shift the balance of democracy in his favour? Well, Boris Johnson told the Queen to let him shut down Parliament so it wouldn't be able to stop him going for a no-deal Brexit, and the Supreme Court declared his actions unlawful. We forget this stuff like it's not a big deal, but follow me on this. The Tories got 42% of the vote in the 2017 election, and Boris Johnson wasn't even the leader of the Tory party that election, so nobody voted Tory expecting to make Boris Johnson our Prime Minister. And yet here he was, an unelected Prime Minister, lying to the Queen so that he could shut down our entire system of democracy, so that he could force through a version of Brexit that he swore would never happen and which every economist was saying would make our economy crumble into shit. Because at least with Trump it was just an attempt to get officials to find a few extra thousand votes so that he could win the election. But Boris Johnson literally nullified the votes of 30 million people by shutting down the parliament that they elected so that he could force through his own policy. So, unlawfully asking officials to rig democracy? Tick. Then there's deliberately using violent language which endangered the lives of fellow politicians, like calling the EU Nazis, calling Remainers traitors, and in this case, calling the law that MPs passed to prevent no deal a surrender act.
With many of us in this place subject to death threats and abuse every single day. And let me tell the Prime Minister that they often quote his words: surrender act, betrayal, traitor.
I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I've never heard such humbug in all my life. The best way to ensure that every parliamentarian is properly safe, and we dial down the current anxiety in this country, is to get Brexit done.
And I know I go on about this, but if you know that MPs are facing death threats because of your language after one MP has already been murdered in the name of your cause, and when they beg you for help, you tell them that the best way to avoid being murdered is to support your cause, you are giving that death threat yourself. In normal life, you go to jail for that stuff. But he just ran for election again in 2019. I mean, let's even park the notion of going to jail for a second. Let me just say that at a very, very minimum, if a court finds that a politician has acted unlawfully while in office or has broken the law while in office, you shouldn't be able to run for election again. Period. Let's just start there. Because if there are no consequences for breaking the law, that law may as well not exist. And when it comes to democracy, those rules are there for a reason, to protect democracy. So those consequences have to A, try and reverse the harm that was done, and B, try and prevent it happening again. For example, we have rules about how much any individual group is allowed to spend during elections just to keep things fair. So if the winning campaign breaks the law and overspends by, let's say £449,000, if we let that result stand, our our entire system is a joke. Like, remember when the Tory party changed the name of their secondary Twitter account to make it look like a fact-checking charity during an election debate? This kind of underhanded shit is what happens when you don't have any real rules. Because the UK, unlike America, doesn't have a written constitution. At least it's not written down in any one place. It's just a mixture of laws and customs which all join together to form constitutional law, but without any single unchangeable text. And as a result, any parliament at any time can vote to do anything without any consequences. That's what's called parliamentary supremacy. In law school, we're taught that parliament can do anything except bind its successors, meaning that if we elect a parliament now, it can go against the laws that were passed by a previous parliament, which is why it feels like there are no rules for politicians these days, because for a long time, the only solid constitutional rules the UK had were international ones like the European Convention on Human Rights and the EU treaties, whereas now, suffice to say, the UK needs a written constitution really badly. Remember when Tory MP Owen Patterson was being paid £112,000 to influence Parliament on behalf of pharmaceutical companies? And the investigation called it an egregious case of paid lobbying and the most prolific case that they'd ever seen. In the real world, we call that bribery. I mean, literally, bribery. Look at the Bribery Act of 2010. It is a criminal offence to accept financial advantage in exchange for the improper performance of a public function in a way that breaches the trust placed in that function. And this dude was an elected official being paid over 100 grand by a private company to go up to ministers and tell them which policies to support. If you or I did something like that, we'd be in jail, but our parliament treats that as paid lobbying, for which the punishment is a month's suspension from parliament. Again, a month's suspension for bribery, and even that was too much for the Tories, which is why they voted to change the rules so that he wouldn't get punished. Now, you've heard of phrases like aiding and abetting or accessory after the fact, whereby if you help somebody get away with a crime after they've committed it, you're charged with the same crime. Well, that's the vast majority of Tory MPs aiding and abetting bribery, and our system does nothing to them. Or there's the time that Robert Jenrick, as housing minister, tried to help a Tory donor avoid paying £45 million to the local council, which would have been spent on low-income families, and then that donor paid the Tories £12,000. That's bribery. He even admitted that it was unlawful, so where is the jail sentence? Then there's Tory member of the House of Lords, Michelle Mone, who's currently sitting on £29 million that she made from a contract that she helped organise for medical equipment during the pandemic, and that equipment didn't even work. That is bribery at the potential expense of human lives, and again, nothing. And right now, Rishi Sunak is trying to do a trade deal with India, knowing that to get the deal over the line, he's going to have to agree to let a lot of Indian people get visas to come here, which goes directly against his party's manifesto promise to cut immigration and against the principles of his party's Brexit. And yet, his wife's family's company would benefit hugely from being able to send its technicians here to work on their contracts. Again, a major politician is about to get a lot of money for breaching the trust that was placed in him by Tory and Brexit voters. And it goes on. What about when the courts found that Matt Hancock acted unlawfully when his government sent 25,000 untested patients into care homes? Because people will have died from that. What about when Matt Hancock had shares in his sister's company and then his department gave that company a contract worth £300,000, which he failed to declare? What about when during the first year of COVID, 99% of the contracts the government did, totaling £18 billion, were awarded without any competition process to make sure those companies could actually do the job? With a clear VIP lane for companies with known links to the Tory party, a VIP lane that was later found to be unlawful by the courts, which means the government was prioritising giving billions of pounds of taxpayer money to their mates while hundreds of thousands of lives were at stake and 200,000 people actually died. So, do you think that deserves jail time or a £320,000 check to go on I'm a Celebrity, get me out of here? And he's free to run for Parliament again. Now, misconduct in public office is already a crime established under UK law, and that does cover when politicians abuse the trust of the public, especially if that breach of trust damages the public, like telling people that Brexit will make them richer, but it actually takes £1,000 for every household during a cost of living crisis. But Boris Johnson still roams free. So when we fix this country and we get some proper rules into the constitution, one that I'll be pushing for is that if a politician lies to the public, under circumstances where it can either be proven that they knew they were lying, or that they should have known the truth because it was easy to find, and that lie leads to significant damage to the public, they should be held criminally responsible for that damage. For example, Rishi Sunak told us that Brexit would give us an immediate £20 billion, and in fact, it is costing us £100 billion a year, so, jail. Wait, do you think I'm being harsh? Because if you lied to HMRC and you cost the public purse £1,000 in taxes, you'd be in jail. Meanwhile, the lies the politicians told us around Brexit have cost the public purse £40 billion in taxes. Their lies are literally 40 million times worse than what you would go to jail for. This kind of stuff happens because the politicians are not scared of the courts and they're not scared of our votes, so we need to change that. Because even as Nadine Dorries was quitting, she bragged about how her seat was one of the safest in the country. Our voting system is what does that. Because when politicians do bad things, sure, it might make public opinion shift a fair bit, but not enough to make a town that has voted Conservative for generations suddenly vote Labour. That's why we need proportional representation, so that the seats in Parliament accurately reflect how the public is thinking. And I know Keir Starmer has said that he won't give us a fair voting system, but we don't need to be nice about this. And I'm aware that it's ironic that I started this video by talking about how wrong it was that Boris Johnson and Donald Trump radicalized the public by talking about how the establishment was rigging democracy against the wishes of the people. And now it looks like I'm about to do the same thing, but there was no voter fraud in America, and the MPs who opposed no deal were just protecting the public from a version of Brexit that they didn't vote for. But when it comes to the voting system, it is a matter of objective fact. Under our system, a party with a minority of the vote almost always gets a majority of the seats in Parliament, so they can do whatever they want without having to even consult the other parties. So the majority of votes have no effect on UK policy. Am I wrong? So anybody who supports this first-past-the-post voting system is supporting a situation where the majority of people in the UK have no democratic power. Am I exaggerating? No. So when Keir Starmer becomes Prime Minister, if he continues to ignore the 80% of his party who want proportional representation and the majority of the country who also want proportional representation, then we need to be prepared to call him the democracy-denying despot that he is. We need to make it politically untenable for him not to change course. I'm Femi. Have a great week.